Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, and I'm wondering if the deer in Dear Evan Hansen in fact relates to the prices of theatre tickets in the West End. Well, if you've been to see Dear Evan Hansen or any other new or newish musical in the West End or Broadway or wherever, have you ever thought, I wonder if this show will still be being produced in 2100, which is 78 years' time? Is this show an evergreen? And I suppose if we knew the answer to that, we'd all be very rich people, because it is intangible. What makes a show have a legacy? What makes it a long-lasting, evergreen masterpiece, or even just a classic, not necessarily a masterpiece? What shows are still in production today, either 100 or nearly 100 years after they were first produced? Well, Gilbert and Sullivan, of course. But you would have to go a long way to try and find Flora Dora from 1899, or Our Miss Gibbs from 1919, although they were huge bona fide hits of their period. Yet you can, with relative ease, find George Gershwin's Lady Be Good from the 1920s, very nearly 100 years old. And there is another one. There's a show that's very nearly 90 years old, which has just closed here in London, and it's a famous one. It's Cole Porter's Anything Goes. It originally opened at the Colonial Theatre in Boston on the 5th of November 1934 and then transferred to the 46th Street Theatre on the 30th of September 1935, where it closed about 6 weeks later after 420 performances in total. Actually, that original cast list for the 1934 production is quite interesting just because of the names of a few of the actors. I should say that the name Pacey Ripple leapt out from the page at me when I was looking at it. That person played Bishop Dodson. And there's a very interesting situation where two actors whose surnames rhyme play characters whose names also rhyme. I think that can only be coincidence, but Richard Wang and Charlie Fang played Ching and Ling. I think we'll turn a blind eye to the race politics of the period and just say, isn't that an interesting coincidence? But of course the star of Anything Goes in that original run was Ethel Merman. Now there's a name that still has some currency today, many years after her death. But I would dare to say that Ethel Merman is not as well known as Anything Goes itself, the show. But who could possibly have imagined in that theatre in Boston on the 5th of November 1934 that the show that the audience were seeing on that day would still, in various forms and in various permutations, because it has changed over the years, still be being produced very nearly 90 years later, both in America and in London and elsewhere across the globe. Now, if you have a quick look at Wikipedia, you might argue that the show really didn't do anything between 1935 and 1987. But that's not true. The productions listed on the Wikipedia page are just some of the main productions. There were many other productions in between, including amateur ones, and a number of versions in the 1960s, including a television version, which featured, reprising her role as Reno Sweeney, Ethel Merman some years after she did it originally. And she's performing against Frank Sinatra as Billy Crocker. And you may be able to find that on one of the video streaming platforms available online. But all this merely goes to show that Anything Goes is an evergreen. It's a perennial. And it looks set to be one of those shows which is periodically revived into the next 50, possibly 100 years again. Will Anything Goes make 200 years? I don't know. But I'm pretty certain it will certainly make its century in just 12 years' time as we record this for Musical Talk. Well, as I say, Anything Goes has just finished in London after a very successful and lengthy run at the Barbican. Slightly off the West End, but certainly a significant venue for theatrical productions. And it lasted long enough to have a significant cast change. And it was televised, and that's the version I saw. But in the week before it closed, our old friend Josh Clark saw it in London with its new cast. And we were both delighted by the show when we saw it in our various versions, and we both wanted to talk about it. So that brings us to what you're going to get here on Musical Talk this week and for the next 3 weeks in total. Because over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be looking at Anything Goes in some detail. This week, we're going to be looking at the history of the show and the context of the narrative, and also start looking at Act 1. And then next week, we'll be looking at Act 1 and the songs in particular in much greater detail. And then in the third week, we'll be looking at Act 2. And for a show that's almost 100 years old, you really can't say fairer than that. After all, this show is a show which is easy to love. And if you know your Cole Porter, you'll realise I'm quoting the name of one of his songs. And if you want me to be even more obvious, I think we'd have to argue that when it comes to musical theatre, Anything Goes is the top. Well, that's enough of me quoting songs from the Cole Porter songbook. Let's get down to the bread and butter and listen to the conversation I had with Josh Clark about Anything Goes, the first of 3. I hope you enjoy this conversation about this evergreen musical theatre show. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Josh, thank you very much for coming back to Musical Talk. As always, a real pleasure to talk to you. How are you this week?
Well, yeah, very well, thank you. I'm looking forward to continuing our conversations that we've been having recently, and this time on a show that we've both seen.
We did, but we saw it in different ways. It's the same production, but you saw it live at the Barbican, and there's a clue, and I saw it when it was televised as a Christmas treat on the BBC on Boxing Day 2021.
And I must say, I did see that one as well.
Ah, you did, right. So you've actually had double bubble in the sense. You've seen it on stage and you've seen the video version. Mm-hmm. I think we should tell people what we're talking about.
Certainly.
Would you care to do the honours?
I will. Anything goes.
It does. It cannot be denied. I was going to do the old joke, but what's the name of the show? But I won't bother.
Well, in fact, just on that, some listeners I'm sure will know about how this musical got its name, but it was something as whimsical as that.
Well, let's start with how the show got its name in 1934. I mean, this is a famous Cole Porter show, and it's been an evergreen, and we mention it periodically here on Musical Talk for 2 main reasons. First of all, it's got Cole Porter all over it, and secondly, it is constantly revived. It is one of the very few pre-Rodgers and Hammerstein musical comedies that gets revived on a semi-regular basis. It's this and Lady Be Good of the two, which Gershwin. So it's Cole Porter and Gershwin are the 2 shows which really come up the most. Now, the Gershwin one is almost untampered with. The Anything Goes has been tweaked and twiddled, but it was tweaked and twiddled from the very beginning, wasn't it? So I think that's... So how did it get its title?
Well, and also, just to preface that on the Gershwin link, Gershwin was approached before Cole Porter. Cole Porter was 3rd choice.
What, for Anything Goes?
That's right.
Who was 2nd choice?
Yeah, I knew as soon as I started that.
Someone else.
Do you know what? I think Gershwin was 2nd choice.
Goodness.
It may come back to me in the course of the conversation, but...
I mean, it's probably going to be Irving Berlin or something like that from 1934. I mean, you know, the people who were absolutely riding high and writing all the music for the Fred Astaire musicals, the Fred and Ginger musicals which were coming out, would be Irving Berlin. I mean, who did it? Jerome Kern, Irving Berlin, Gershwin, and Cole Porter. Well, Cole Porter had one of his stage shows turned into one of the Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire musicals, but I don't think he wrote one specifically for the film. So, yes, it's going to be one of them, isn't it?
It'll be one of them. So Anything Goes, the name... I think it went through a few different working titles, didn't it?
Isn't there one called Hard to Keep?
Maybe Hard to Keep, certainly Bon Voyage.
Oh, one of the songs.
Bon Voyage and Bon Voyage, depending on where you're from. But the initial production in the early 30s was beset with difficulties and problems. You've alluded to a later rewrite, but at the time it was due to debut. It had already been through a almost complete rewrite. You know, it was P.G. Wodehouse, wasn't it, who initially...
It's Guy Bolton and P.G. Wodehouse are the original writers, both born Brits, by the way, incidentally, although obviously doing a lot of work in America at that time. And it's interesting when you realise that one of the characters is such a silly-ass Brit, that actually these 2 British writers should do that, but they're playing for the American audience. But as you quite rightly say, they wrote a version of it, which was almost immediately jettisoned, I think. Is that correct?
There were some changes that had to be made. This was another of the problems which bedeviled the production, that, for people who don't know, this is set on a luxury
steam cruise liner. Yes, an unsinkable Titanic.
Indeed, but it originally featured a very major fire on board, and not too long before the show was meant to go up, in reality, there was a major cruise ship disaster along very similar lines, and so the producers, I think it was around about 6 weeks before it was due to open, came to the conclusion that really it was a bit too close to the bone to represent that on stage, so it had to go through a rewrite. But I think that P.G. Wodehouse and his collaborator were no longer. Yeah,
they'd moved on to other things.
They were doing another project, weren't they? And so, yes, it had to be rewritten there and then. Only a few lines of the original remained. So we then get a very successful show which opened, but as you were saying, it largely changed.
Well, yes, I mean, it's like a lot of shows. So basically the original phase is 1934, more or less. As you say, the Bolton and Woodhouse version is, their name's all over it, but most of that stuff's jettisoned. For the two new writers from 1934, whose names I've forgotten, but I do know that they went on to work on musical films right up until films up until the 60s. The Sound of Music,
that's
I think.
Right. That's exactly right. Yeah, this was their first
work together.
It was, wasn't it? Yeah.
In fact, this is how they got to collaborate, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And funny enough, Guy Bolton, who we were talking about earlier, contributed to the Fred Astaire film vehicle Easter Parade, which is another perennial musical film. So, these people all went, and we don't need to talk about P.G. Wodehouse, who's famous for so many reasons. He rewrote Gershwin musicals in the 1960s with Ira Gershwin's permission. And he wrote He's Just My Bill with Jerome Kern, which is one of the great standards. So, all four of these original people have got it in their bones. They've got the musical theatre and film chops. But in terms of the history of the show, you're quite right. That original version is the version that was, it was tinkered with, I think, in the 60s, but it was essentially the same version. But there was a significant rewrite, re-squared right, I suppose, in 1987. And it is the 1987 version, which gets periodically tweaked and twiddled again, but the fundamental rewrite, and that storyline from 87 is the one we're still seeing today, and most of the revivals use that in some form. As I say, songs get moved around and added or made longer or shorter, but for the most part what you're seeing is what they rewrote in 87, which uses a lot of the beats of the original, but does change things quite considerably, and I'm sure we'll talk about that.
So, out of that long and winding exposition from the both of us, we see that it was a very complicated thing to get the show actually up on its feet to start with. So production meetings were happening with the people involved. They couldn't for certain settle on an actual title, and in one particular discussion a question was raised about a certain aspect of the production. Should they change it? Should they do something? And one of the head chaps in charge at the time said, well, with this show anything goes. And it was just a throwaway remark which led to the title and the famous song which closes Act 1.
Just as well you didn't say, with this show we're all buggered.
Indeed, that's still in the works, I think.
But of course it has become an evergreen, even if it's by accident. That's so often the way, isn't it? Serendipity in theatre is not an uncommon situation. The thing about Anything Goes is we all know of it. We all know most of the songs from it, or many of the songs from it. Or certainly I don't think we'd be surprised if someone then said this song comes from it, or when you're in the audience, if you don't know what's coming and then a song comes up and you think, well, I know this. I didn't know it was from this. Although sometimes the songs are not from this, but they're now from this, if that makes sense, following tweaks and twiddles. But from your point of view, how much do you know about Anything Goes before you went in? Either in terms of its legend, had you seen it before? What do you know of Cole Porter? What expectations upon arrival at the Barbican?
Well, when, like we suggested earlier, when I'd seen it on screen around Christmas time with the first cast, as it was at the time, that was the first time that I had seen it, let's still say, on stage. It was a screen performance.
In its entirety,
In its entirety.
You certainly got the flavour of it without the atmosphere, maybe. That's the way of putting it.
Yeah. In previous roles before, I've worked with some of the music and had groups perform, some numbers, because they are theatre standards, aren't they, a lot of them. But I didn't know all the ins and outs of the plot. And even now I'd probably struggle to recount all the crazy...
Peregrinations.
I think that word does get used in it as well. A great word. But it is twisty-turny.
Thank you for your simultaneous translations. I appreciate it.
Yes. For my own benefit. But no, I didn't know much about the plot, and It's just fun.
Yeah, that is, I think, you've immediately gone to the heart of the matter, haven't you?
It's just silliness, and it's why I think it's so apposite that it's been put on and revived around about now. Because, again, to go back to when it was first produced, this was around the time of a similar kind of economic
the depression.
shock.
Absolutely,
the Great Depression. Yeah. And a lot of the work in America was around that, and it was political work, and Anything Goes really stood alone in just being escapism.
Yeah.
And
throwaway, except it's the one piece that hasn't been thrown away. There's the irony.
Exactly. And the director or producer of the current revival is actually framing this in the context of COVID-19 and saying that we're all coming out of the shadow of that. So again, what better show to bring us back to the theatre, to bring us out of the shadows, than just to lose ourselves in this escapist,
soothing
fun.
balm, quite. Do you know, that's such an interesting thing? And you were just saying there, that actually there were lots of much more worthy pieces in the sense of, traditional worth of theatre and musicals. And the one that immediately comes to mind, because it's musical theatre, of course, is Gershwin's Of Thee I Sing, which was considered so satirical in the mid-1930s. It actually won a Pulitzer Prize, which is the first time a musical had ever won a Pulitzer Prize for sort of worthiness. And it's a satirical take on America, and it's also one of the very few musicals that gets a sequel. There's a sequel called Let 'Em Eat Cake, where actually later in the 1930s, where basically America becomes a fascistic state. So you can see the fairly full-on parodic elements of it, or satirical, I should say. But the thing about them is they're both fantastic works, as you'd expect, by Gershwin. And whilst they are, they're the closest thing Gershwin got to with operetta, actually. So he's also been semi and pseudo-operatic, whereas Anything Goes is none of that at all. And yet here it is, bouncing along into the 21st century, and well into the 21st century. And I would expect, I expect to see Anything Goes performed every 10 to 20 years in the West End or thereabouts for the rest of the... Well, I don't know if I'll be here for the rest of the century, but I'm expecting it to last.
And I hope so, actually.
Yes.
Now that I've seen it, it was one of the best nights I've had at the theatre in London for quite a while. Thoroughly bought into the silliness of it. The froth. And do you know what? This was one of the shows where it really justified having the big headline casting.
Now, you were drawn by the cast, weren't you?
I was, yeah, and that doesn't often happen for me, actually. I think we've spoken before on Musical Talk about, the fact that there are so many amazingly talented and highly trained musical theatre performers in the country, and we love to see them being given a chance.
Yes.
It's great to see undiscovered
talent coming through.
And debutants and things like that. And I've certainly spoken before about relishing seeing understudies a lot of the time, because they seize their opportunity, and it can be the making of people.
The stars of tomorrow.
Yeah. Now, in contrast, I would ordinarily want to go and see as many new shows as possible, or new shows to me at least. So having seen Anything Goes on screen at Christmas, it certainly was not on my agenda to go and see it live.
Particularly, yeah.
But when I saw that Kerry Ellis was playing Reno Sweeney...
And not Moonface Martin.
No, indeed. Backed up with Simon Callow. Imagine Simon Callow in Anything Goes. A great Shakespearean and classical actor.
Can I just briefly interview? But I did interview him for his appearance as Captain Hook in Peter Pan some years ago, so he does like to put his toe in the water every now and then.
But what a draw. Bonnie Langford, who I saw as Adelaide in Guys and Dolls over a decade ago.
And was in 42nd Street at Drury Lane only a few years ago. Yeah. A proper British musical theatre star.
All sorts, exactly. And it just added a layer of star quality. And I mean, as soon as you see Kerry Ellis is leading it, you relax into it. And almost the opposite effect of what we were talking about last week with Only Fools and Horses, and having to
ease your way in, as it were. Yeah, quite.
No, from the first second where we see Simon Callow propping up the bar and walking off with 2 bottles of wine, which serves as his double, you're going to be in for a good night. And also served magnificently by this very big, for modern West End standard, orchestras.
Well, I wanted to ask you about the orchestra because, fun enough, well, I'm going to do it now immediately. And this is not a gripe; it's a concern, because, and I know the answer to this, but obviously, you're a musical director in one of the many strings to your bow, and so you may have a view on this. But when you listen to old score recordings of shows, certainly from the 50s and 60s, there's a lush sound, there's a lot more violins, there's a lot more oomph, maybe more brass. And so many of these shows in their early recordings have got a great weight to them musically, if that makes sense. I like what I see up in the West End these days, and yes, and you were at the Barbican, and it sounds like you had a good-sized theatre orchestra. But of course it won't be the size it would have been 40 years ago or 80 years ago, and that's understandable too. But what you get is a slightly, what's the word I'm trying to use? It's just not as heavy, and therefore it feels a little bit more saccharine almost, or not sketchy. It's certainly not sketchy because there's no failure of professionalism. What you don't get is the wall of sound.
Yeah, the richness, the lushness of the sound.
And so that, to me, and unfortunately you see that all the time in modern reproductions of old musicals. And so it always seems to me, even things like Company, which started. If you listen to the original recording of Company from 1970, and then you go, and then you saw it in the West End only 3 years ago. Whilst the performances and the productions, the show's moved on, but I would say that the soundscape has just become a little thinner.
Yes, I think talking generally, that's definitely the case. The thing with Anything Goes, perhaps in contrast with I'm assuming we're referencing Rodgers and Hammerstein shows,
that kind of thing.
Yes, which are certainly, I think we'd call them orchestral.
Yes,
is that Anything Goes is more big band or concert band style. So rather than being dominated by a large string section, the brass and saxophones in particular really come to the fore.
It's a lovely bit of wobbly trombone in one of the throwaway songs actually as well.
Yeah, lots of that, and that was very evident last night.
I suppose the other difference is that you're actually seeing it in a theatre which is designed to showcase, the orchestra sound in the Barbican is excellent. And it's a modern theatre in the sense it was, late 60s, early 70s, but in the sense it was designed to be much more of an auditorium than a show place. So it's not a Frank Matcham theatre, which are beautiful, but your orchestra's in a pit. Here, the orchestra is much more able to be heard. So I've just wondered, and of course I'm relying on the television recording, so you get good hi-fi sound from television. What you don't necessarily get is the depth. Certainly not on my equipment. But whereas you were in the auditorium, would you say that you got much more of a wall of sound, which I'm not quite getting from my television?
Definitely, more so than many shows that I've seen in the last few years. Yeah, this felt like what you would imagine going to see a West End musical really is and should be.
And should be, yes. Yeah. I think that hits the nail on the head, rather, doesn't it? So now here's a question. The thing about Anything Goes, we've mentioned it's frothy. It is in some senses, you're not going in for the plot. You're going in for the plot as a way of hanging songs and a lot of comedy. Now, the performers you've already identified as being absolutely spot on, as they were in the earlier iterations of the cast. Gary Wilmot opens as Eli Whitney in the production on television that was shown, and you mentioned the fact he walks off with 2 bottles of whiskey. But there's also a lovely scene. He's at the bar drinking when Billy Crocker turns up right at the beginning of the show, and the barman says to Whitney, he says, "Would you like another, sir?" And Whitney just says, absolutely deadpan, "No, 7's my limit." And 7 is such an interesting number. It just it's so far up the scale, but it's immediately stupidly hilarious, and no one bats an eyelid. So it's also got that kind of deadpan comedy thing. So the comedy chops were all over it, and the comedy played all the way through as far as I was concerned. But of course it is in some senses just a way of hanging a series of really rather excellent Cole Porter songs which have their own sophistication for the most part, one after the other. That's what it felt like on television. And I have seen it on stage before. I saw it with John Barrowman about 20 years ago, playing Billy Crocker. One of the things that propelled him to fame in this country, actually, I think, in real terms, certainly in theatre land. How did it seem to you? Did it cohere more as a piece overall, or would you say that the Cole Porter top 10 is still the main thing of it?
I think it worked much better being there live in person.
And I'm not going to disagree with you.
No, I know exactly what you mean, because I had that same feeling having watched it on television the first time around. But no, what was nice about this, and I was actually discussing this with an audience member sitting next to me in the interval yesterday, that it's a musical of the type that I don't think we see as much being written these days.
No.
Where, by that I mean, you've got excellent music and songs, you've got the show-stealing dance numbers, and you've also got very protracted just acting.
Yeah.
Without either of the two in it. You know, it's
dialogue acting.
Yes,
yes.
It's almost
and performance.
A triple threat show. You know, we talk about triple threat performance, but how many times do we see new musicals which are all about the music or are pretty much dance shows? You know, or dialogue is just used to get you to the next song. Whereas there's genuine, I hesitate to say drama, but
incident.
Yeah.
And reaction to incidents. So performance, yes.
That's right. And so for that reason, I think we can say that there is more to it than just this song's coming next, let's get to it, which was really enjoyable.
Yes, I'm really pleased to hear that. And you're right, I hadn't actually stopped to think that ironically these sort of throwaway things from the 30s, because they did speech marks everything, are in their way the spectacular, which we simply don't have today. You know, when people talk about spectaculars in London in the West End for musicals, they talk about a show-stopping bit of prop work like chitty chitty bang bang flying over the audience, or the chandelier coming down in Phantom of the Opera. You know, that's show-stopping. And you're right, and the big hits, you know, and we're going to be talking about these on other occasions here on Musical Talk, but, you know, Dear Evan Hansen is not a dance piece. Come From Away is not a dance piece. There's performances integrated with the songs, but actually that does it? I suppose there's an argument to be had. Maybe we'll discuss another day whether performance in a song is a constraint or not in terms of performance and acting.
It's certainly different.
It is different. That's a really good observation.
And what I really enjoyed about the character of Reno Sweeney, really, is that we were able to see Kerry Ellis do what we all know she's amazing at, which is, as you suggest,
the ironing.
Quite. But the acting through song, that's always going to be good. But actually getting to see her just acting as well was fantastic.
All the facets of her abilities, in fact. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. But it's a really interesting point, which, funny enough, it seems so simple that I've never stopped to think about it, but you're absolutely right. You know, you are required to do more as one of the lead performers in Anything Goes than you might be in some other shows. And actually, therefore you need more to be more of an all-rounder, to use that old-fashioned phrase. You know.
And I think you're able to put more of your own stamp on the character, because I'm sure probably many people listening might have seen both versions as well, you know, or both casts. Yeah. And
Sutton Foster playing the Reno Sweeney role in the television and earlier, yes.
Very different from Kerry Ellis's portrayal.
Which once again shows your point, doesn't it, actually, that actually you can stamp something of yourself in the character as written. Because it demands so much of you in all the spheres that you can bring to the table.
Yeah.
Gosh, yes. Do you know, I find that really interesting. Thank you. Who'd have thought that the things that were considered absolutely staples for musical theatre are now so exotic a combination?
Well, how many... I don't know the answer to this question, but how many leading lady or leading man roles are being written as the old triple threat parts?
Almost none.
Almost none. What would you say about if I were to suggest that the modern musicals tend to be more casting singers who can act rather than actors who sing?
Or actors who can play.
Well, sure, yeah.
Yes, quite.
But that feels, to me at least, as being at least one major trend of the West End.
Undoubtedly. Also, I think, I must say this, you know, there's much less musical comedy out there. And actually, I think if you're portraying musical drama, then actually the beats of the drama perhaps require you to be more constrained, whereas actually in comedy, we still expect, you know, sitcoms, funnily enough, taking us back to our discussion of last week, are cast on the ability of the actors. You could be a dramatic actor who can't do comedy. So you've got to have those extra skills to be able to do comedy. So is a musical comedy, in fact, actually requiring a greater versatility? Or certainly a different skill set anyway. So yes, you're right. And the fact that you can do it differently and still be true to the Reno Sweeney character. I mean, here's an interesting thing. You know, we all know that one of the original Reno Sweeneys, and well, I think she was the original, and certainly then did it again 20, 30 years later, was the effervescent, let's say, Ethel Merman, you know, the old bel canto and cam belto, as she was known. She had a very particular stage personality and a stage charisma, and that's what Reno Sweeney has got. But I'm not sure I would necessarily believe that Ethel Merman, and I never seen her performance, but Ethel Merman's Reno Sweeney would have the tenderness that's also required in moments, you know, some of the acting chops. But then again, I suspect if you're Ethel Merman, you can play that comedically. So, because there's enough flexibility, you know, the fact that Ethel Merman and Kerry Ellis and Sutton Foster and Elaine Page have all played Reno Sweeney, and successfully, totally differently, I would imagine, certainly from what I can remember and what I've seen, tells you something about the characters. Now you can say, well, that means the plot has been written so loosely, and at one level that's true, or the characters have been written loosely, you know, but they're character pieces, aren't they? Come in and fill this in the way that you want. Could you do that in... I don't think you can necessarily do that in 42nd Street. Ironically, the character who's probably got most opportunity to do it differently in 42nd Street is the sort of the ageing star who's sort of on the way out, if you like, and who finds love and then leaves the story after she's had her hip broken by Peggy.
And maybe this is another strand of why Anything Goes has maintained its appeal. Because, you know, it does bear seeing, well, at least twice in 9 months or so, but, you know,
with no diminution of enjoyment. Here's a question though: if we were analysing this using the old money, as it were, for stage musicals, and of course we can because it's a 1930s comedy, the principle in the old days, people would recognise immediately the different roles of the ingenue and the soubrette. And the easiest way to describe that is that Hope Harcourt is the ingenue. She's the sweet character about whom we're supposed to care. And carries the emotional weight, if you like, of the piece. And the soubrette is normally, historically, the one who ends up in the secondary comedy couple, who carries the comedy business, and whom we're not supposed to care about so much, even though they might be doing the dynamic of the work. And of course, it had the opportunity on stage to allow you to, you know, hire your Anna Neagles for the ingenue, you know, the sweet ones who may not be able to have the comedy chops, and your someone like Elsie Randolph, who was very famous in the 1930s and worked a lot with Jack Buchanan in the soubrette role. And indeed, I can think of a musical they did together now from 1931 called Stand Up and Sing, which was, at least a section of it, is set on a steam cruiser liner.
There you go.
Not all of it, but and I've seen there's a little bit of Pathé movie footage on YouTube of her leading the dance of the sailors and the female chorus on the deck of the ship. That she's doing it as a soubrette. You would not expect the ingenue to be doing that. And that's what Reno Sweeney is. Reno Sweeney is the soubrette who normally, in comedies of this kind, has all the comedy, does the dynamic work, but doesn't get the guy, because she's the secondary hero. And that's exactly what happens here. Because actually Reno Sweeney is the one who makes it all work. And she ends up marrying a totally different character, whereas Hope Harcourt and Billy Crockett, who are clearly going to get together, ladies and gentlemen. Spoilers after 1934, sorry.
I saw parallels, the more I was watching it, with Thoroughly Modern Millie.
Now that's interesting. Now, Thoroughly Modern Millie, the musical,
yes.
Or the film?
Well, yes, the stage version I was thinking.
But even those two are both modern, you know. Thoroughly Modern Millie is a 1970s, 1972 or something strange, I think. Certainly 60s, 70s. And the stage version was created in the 80s and 90s. So tell me more.
Well, just in, I suppose, the nature of the show and its silliness and twists and turns and things, but just picking up on what you were saying there about the pair of female characters, because you have Millie, of course, and Miss Dorothy, in more of the roles that you're describing there.
The ingenue and the soubrette. Yeah.
Probably in the more expected manner. Because there's a lot about Reno Sweeney, which, in her character, we're probably not meant to like.
Well, the fact that she's friendly with, I mean, she's very friendly with gangsters.
With the criminals,
yes.
That's right. Who are oddly and delightfully lauded as some strange kind of heroes, aren't they?
Hence Anything Goes, of course, which is the turning of... I mean, that I thought it was quite telling, but, you know, exactly when Billy Crocker is thought to be public enemy number one, and then Moonface Martin sort of comes in for some of the action as well, that's when Anything Goes really comes out as your Act 1 well, is it the closer at Act 1? But it's yes, I
Yes,
think
it is. Yes,
exactly, because it's saying, look, things have changed so much.
Yes, yeah, times have changed. That is the
and we've
the
often
lead into
around the
song,
clock, isn't it? Yes,
yeah.
Quite.
But just nice to. I really think I was making the parallel because it's just another one of those musicals where you've got all three elements coming together. Not without its problems, Thoroughly Modern Millie, of course, but that's for another episode. And with the same tropes as characters.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's interesting to me that I mean it's a throwback musical, Thoroughly Modern Millie, to the 20s.
Yeah.
And you can merge the 20s and 30s as an era for musical comedy. There is increasing sophistication, as we've mentioned with Gershwin, but even so, you've still got the standards that you'd expect of a musical comedy of that period. And it's interesting that you can shuffle the cards and end up with all these different shows from that period. But they're not formulaic, but they share some structural similarities.
And you know what? Maybe the next direction for the conversation, either notionally or actually to have now, is to recognise that we're, the two of us, speaking in quite nostalgic terms here, for musical theatre shows which are the traditional showcasing of the three disciplines.
Yes.
Which we love, and lots of musical theatre fans will come to the genre through those shows. But then we talk a lot here and off mic about how the genre is developing, and shows like Hamilton are so successful because they are so different. And
it's a broad church, though, isn't it? Musical theatre.
It is, but it hasn't always been.
Oh, that's true. Right.
And
well, go on.
I would venture not quite as much as it is becoming now. So you can go and see, Six, which is basically a rock concert. We can go and see Hamilton, which is a hip-hop
rap musical, quite
narrative.
Yeah.
Neither of which fit into the
models of the past.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I will just make... I'd just like to make one extra point about that, though. The thing is that we also now conglomerate almost all musical theatre under one heading. And actually, if we were in the 1930s, there would also have been comic opera, operetta. For whatever reason, the Sigmund Romberg operetta, as we would call them, and the Ivor Novello stuff, are not thought of as musical theatre or musical comedy. They're thought of as being a different thing, and therefore never sort of remembered in the books. And people make that big difference some people make a big difference between Gilbert and Sullivan, and then what immediately arose from Gilbert and Sullivan, like Dorothy, 1894, and then Cohan over in America in around 1900. People say, musical theatre is very different. Well, it is, but it's actually an extension and a broadening of the form of musical theatre at the time. So I accept what you're saying. It's continually getting bigger and bigger, but I think it would be wrong to say that in the 1930s there was only one kind of musical theatre.
No.
It's broader than it appeared at the time to our modern perspective. We've broadened where we are now, but I think we've narrowed our memories.
Yes, perhaps. I think maybe where I was going is struggling to think of newer shows which are following the conventions of a show like Anything Goes.
Well, yes. What is... there are musical comedies around, and some things which are just fluff. So, for example, Dirty Rotten Scoundrels is essentially a fluff comedy musical. I don't think it's trying to tell us much about the human condition. And dramatically, it's a farce, really, in some senses. But it doesn't, as far as I can remember, follow what we've been talking about, the ingenue and the soubrette concept, and even though Anything Goes, I think, was originally 2-act, musical comedies of that period probably would have most likely been 3 acts. So, even you could argue Anything Goes was doing something different, I suppose. Yes, it's interesting. I suspect this is something we might have to revisit. Musical talk. And there we are, Josh Clark and me talking about Anything Goes, the Cole Porter classic from 1934 that refuses to lie down. It's pretty clear that the SS American, the cruise ship on which all the action takes place, is not likely to be scrapped soon. And if it is, I hope it's not in the next 2 weeks, because as I say, next week we'll be hearing more about Act 1, and in particular we'll be doing an in-depth analysis of the songs, and then the week afterwards you'll be hearing all about Act 2. But for the time being, I think that brings this episode of Musical Talk to an end, and I do hope it's whetted your appetite for the next 2 weeks here on Musical Talk. So until we meet again, in precisely 7 days, let me say goodbye. And I hear that you have given me permission to do so, so here I go. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, presented by Thos Ribbits and Josh Clark, and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2022. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos. I have actually got a little bit more.
Oh, yes.
Let me know when you want another, by the way.
I'll be right now. I've actually got some water in there.
We'll pace ourselves.